Good evening. Goodbye Forever by Ngak'chang Rinpoche, Volume 2, Chapter 27, Part 1. Jumping Jack Flashman. Boots Warehouse, continental shifts and 2 hours overtime every day. That was now history. I'd worked 10 hours a day for 8 weeks. I was glad, beyond words, to have left Boots Warehouse. I found factory work the most inhumane of all job options. Labouring on roadworks or building sites was far easier, even though the toil was physically harder. I had needed to earn money, however, and as swiftly as possible. I wanted to be in the Himalayas by the autumn, so I had to take any work that was going. There were 2 weeks left before my flight to India. I somehow felt in need of a rest before setting out. Not the kind of rest one requires when exhausted, because although the work at Boots Warehouse had been hard, I felt no weariness once it was concluded. The rest I felt I needed was simply space. Space in which there was nothing that had to happen. Space sans timetable, schedule, agenda, programme or itinerary. I practiced the Nakmo Druptab. I spent time with my mother. We watched television in the evenings. Not often, just old movies when they happened to be screened. Casablanca, The African Queen, Gone with the Wind. We sat in the garden. We ate delicious English scones with fine German coffee. Normal is whatever it is. I remembered the words of Düd'jom Rinpoche. With each life circumstance, whatever is enacted, stare directly into the enactment with all the senses. I was no longer an art student, and although I occasionally drew parts of the apple tree, I came to wonder why. Merely habit? Maybe. Did I enjoy it? Yes. Did I draw merely because I felt morally impelled? Possibly. Was I even an artist anymore? Yes. But how was that artist going to create images beyond the sacred precincts of an art school? There'd be tanka painting studies in the Himalayas, but that was an entirely different field of endeavour from art as I knew it at art school. I'd not been a bluesman for years. Occasionally I wondered about that and about Kyabjé Düd'jom Rinpoche's advice always to sing Hoochie Coochie Man, the song I had sung at his request in 1971. Hoochie Coochie Man, then, was the one song I sang, once a week without fail, in order to keep what I felt to be my Danzig. I was, however, not singing it to any audience. The song amused my mother because she didn't even recognise the language as English. That made me smile because Frank Berner had taught me well in terms of black American Southern accent. I could still do that, although how I'd sound to a black American audience was open to question. I still had a few harps, a B, A and G. The G was my favourite as it was the lowest. Some people liked the higher pitched harps, but they were castrato squeakers as far as I was concerned. I wish that the companies who made them offered lower register harps. Would it hurt them to make a low F fourth? My mother liked to hear me play harp. She said it was good for me to play and to remember my old friends. She always called them Stephen and Ronald. I was touched that my mother should remember Steve and Ron as musicians, and that she regarded the Savage Cabbage Blues Band as having been an important part of my life. She told me that they would not have wanted me to give up playing the music we loved. She asked me if I ever missed being on stage. Well, yes, I did. I did when I thought about it, when I cast my mind back. It had always been magical, standing there on a stage, or even simply at one end of a room in a pub. Somehow there was never anyone there in terms of what I sensed myself to be. That I had been a member of the Savage Cabbage Blues Band, and as a member I was almost a cipher. Strangely, I never saw singing as being a skill, because I thought anyone could sing. Steve and Ron were the heroes, Jack was the drummer, and I was merely there. That could sound as if I was uninvolved, detached, distant, or indifferent, but that was distinctly not the case. It was simply that I had no sense of myself. I had no sense of being anyone. There was no sense of being important, prominent, or remarkable. That I was in the public eye played no part in what I was doing there. I was simply occupying a space where I felt absolutely at home. Sometimes it felt as if I was someone in a film that was being watched, and that all I was light shining through celluloid. Now the projector light had ceased to shine. The switch had been thrown. The plug had been pulled. Only static celluloid remained in terms of the bluesman I had been. Generally, post-Boots Warehouse, I seemed to be no thing, a presence on the brink of something. That something was locus I only understood intermittently. Did I see things in this way because of my Vajrayana studies? Was this something that arose naturally through practice? This amorphousness was not what it once was. Back in the summer of 1970, with the loss of Lindy Dale and the deaths of Ron and Steve, I'd been aware of being a space that was intermittently defined by other factors. But then it had not been joyous. I was not exactly joyous at this point in time, but I was somewhat serene, now that I was no longer at Boots Warehouse. I had moments of monumental joy whenever it occurred to me that I would soon see Kyabjé Düd'jom Rinpoche again. I tried, however, not to fixate too much on the future. Devotion was one thing, but absconding from the present moment was not something that would have met with Düd'jom Rinpoche's approbation. I had no doubts about my life as a Ngakpa, or even distantly as a potential Lama. I'd embraced that in 1971. That was my life, whichever way I was to live it. My vague sense of apprehension was more concerned with what the shape of my life was going to be. It would have been easier if I'd been a thoroughgoing card-carrying hippie, but I had a sense of responsibility. I didn't merely want to drift. I didn't want to end up as a pathetic freeloader. I concluded every time I thought about it that it was too early to tie myself up with such considerations. If I was serious, I would make something worthwhile of my functional life, whatever happened. I wasn't lazy, so I should take solace in that as a redeeming characteristic. Packing was not a huge concern. I'd pick up extra robes in MacLeod Ganj. I knew a good tailor. He'd get them ready in under a week. I only needed 2 of each article to travel. It seemed surreal, knowing that I was going to be away from Britain for 6 months. but then life was generally surreal. I'd exchanged some letters with Penelope, Merrill and Rebecca. I'd also written to Det, but Det hadn't answered. I had her telephone number, but decided that I'd respect her wish to sever all ties. I'd already sent a letter and 2 cards, so it was unlikely they'd all been lost in the post. Maybe it was for the best. The one who leaves has the psychological advantage, and friendships can only be established when the rejected partner has a new beau or belle. One afternoon I realised that I'd forgotten to obtain a bottle of Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne. My father had recommended it as a fine cure for Delhi belly. It stood me in good stead back in 1971 when I first went out to India. My father had always feared that I'd become a drug fiend, and so it amused me many years later to discover that my father had been my first and only pusher. Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne had an opiate content. I had no idea of this, but as I only resorted to it when I needed to calm the effects of amoebic dysentery, I never became aware of it as a mind-altering substance. If the truth were known, it wasn't just the Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne that prompted me to grab a bus into Farnham. I wanted to make a last visit, just for old time's sake. I was nothing if not sentimental. I jumped a bus, took a seat and sat watching the still familiar landscape glide by. The bus rolled past the road where Timothy Fry had demonstrated his hauteur as a kamikaze warrior. That had been back in 1965. We were cycling down the hill toward Farnham after school. Timothy Fry told me that he was studying to be a kamikaze warrior. I didn't believe a word of it. He explained that it was a correspondence course, but that not everyone was selected. He'd been chosen out of 1,000 applicants. So, I asked, how exactly do you train to be a suicide pilot by correspondence course? Simple, he replied. You write and explain your acts of bravery. Such as? I asked. Such as this, he yelled and swerved to the other side of the road to face the oncoming car. I immediately pulled over to the side of the road to create as much distance as I could between us. Timothy Fry then charged the oncoming car, waving his bicycle pump around his head and screaming, "Bonsai!" He'd mistaken bonsai for banzai, but I wasn't of a mind to argue the point. The car, hooting loudly, swerved over to my side of the road to avoid him, and Timothy Fry made good his escape down Monkton Lane. The incident was never reported to the police, or if it was, he was never brought to book for it. The driver didn't stop to question me, and so I cycled on, wondering how long Timothy Fry was going to live. Remembering the event made me laugh aloud. I could imagine the kamikaze trainer saying to his trainees, "Watch carefully, lads. I'm only going to show you this once." Passengers looked round at me. A middle-aged woman moved to another seat. The image of Timothy Fry, the kamikaze cyclist, screaming, "Stunted ornamental Japanese tree," had just erupted out of nowhere. Timothy Fry had shaved since he was 8, by his own account, and by the stubble on his face I could well believe it. I was thought unusual to have had a moustache at the age of 14, but that was nothing on Timothy Fry. He even had to shave his nose. No word of a lie. I saw the bristles on his nose one day when he'd not shaved for a couple of days. He was as thin as a rake, smoked like a chimney, and suffered almost permanent bronchitis. That memory brought on a welter of other memories. Then, almost surprisingly, I found myself in Farnham. I had obtained a bottle of Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne, and having stowed it in my shoulder bag, proceeded to walk down the river to Hatch Mill, the site of the foundation course. There was no one there. That should have been obvious, so I sat looking at the building, wondering why I'd taken the trouble of walking there from the town. I rose to my feet from the tree stump on which I'd sat. I wandered past the willow trees where I'd sat for the gender-reversed painting of Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. I'd been the naked man having a picnic with two ladies dressed in Victorian apparel borrowed from Farnham Theatre. I still had the idea of being some sort of key figure in the world of the arts in those days. I'd been younger and somehow blessed, if I can use such a word, with an outrageous degree of naivety. Anything had been possible. But that was in 1970. Now it was 1975, and it felt as if a century had passed. How could that bright young fellow have died? Well, everyone's a bright young something or other at art school. But then you're eventually out in the world having to create your own meaning. Even if I'd been accepted by the RCA for an MA, even if I'd gone on to take a PhD, it would all have come to an end. Gradually, the students around me would have become increasingly something else, something other than students of the 60s. I felt ever so slightly desolate. A few too many losses had piled up. The incremental effect seemed to be weighing on me, but in ways that were not simple to calculate. I knew my father had to die at some point. I had known his time was nearing an end for a while. I remembered the words of Düd'jom Rinpoche. With each life circumstance, whatever is enacted, stare directly into the enactment with all the senses. Although we'd got on fairly well since 68, we'd not had the degree of closeness that would allow a deep sense of grief. But grief was there nonetheless. I felt sorry for the way his life had gone, and the way he'd never obtained what he wanted. Having become a major from entering the army as a private soldier, he'd thought he could segue into the class of his fellow officers. That had not happened, partially because he was unwilling to toe the line. I had become very much like him in certain ways, and was glad I was able to admit it. Years before, I would have said that I was nothing like my father in any respect, but I was wrong. It was good to be able to thank my father, if only in my mind, for giving me the example of holding to principles and not being swayed by fashion. The list of identifiers, indicators, and reference points that pointed to me were being nullified one by one, leaving only a space which observed what it wasn't. Before I knew where I was somewhere else. I was back in Farnham town and approaching Downing Street. I found myself walking into the Nostril Cafe. It wasn't called the Nostril Cafe. That's just what the lads had called it. But what it was actually called eludes me. It was made to look like a cave inside with badly constructed blue stalagmites and stalactites. This was always where we went to pass an hour with an indifferent cup of coffee. The coffee was better than most places, but still nowhere near German coffee. There was a face I gradually recognised as I looked for a free table. Jack Hackman.